It was the kind of morning that feels like the world itself is holding its breath. Mist clung to the ridges of the Smoky Mountains, sliding like pale fingers between the trees, swallowing sound and shape. The parking lot at Newfound Gap was almost deserted, just the hum of a single vehicle cooling in the dawn air, a white Ford Escape. Inside, the seats still warm from someone who had been here only hours before. On the dashboard, folded neatly, was a note, just 7 words. "Don't try to follow me." The words were blunt, chilling. They read like both a warning and a plea. That vehicle belonged to 24-year-old Derek Joseph Lueking, a young man from Tennessee, just 2 months shy of his 25th birthday. By the time Rangers and his family pieced together the trail, Derek was already gone. Not just gone from his hotel room in Cherokee, North Carolina, or from his car parked high above the valleys, but gone in a way that felt intentional, deliberate, like he had stepped straight into the vast, unknowable heart of the mountains and closed the door behind him. And yet nothing about what followed made sense. Because if Derek had planned to vanish, why did he leave behind some of the very tools he would need to survive? A brand new tent, a sleeping bag, items carefully chosen for a trek in the backcountry, abandoned in his car like afterthoughts. If he intended to live off the land, as some would claim, why did he carry only the bare minimum into terrain known for swallowing hikers whole? And if he was saying goodbye to the world in some final act, why wasn't he ever found? Search teams scoured the ridges and hollows for days, with dogs, helicopters, and volunteers combing mile after mile of steep Appalachian wilderness. And still, nothing. Not a shoe print, not a torn piece of fabric, not even the echo of his name when rescuers shouted into the trees. It was as though Derek had been erased. But the Smoky Mountains do not easily give up their secrets. Years later, in the same wilderness where Derek was last seen, a backpack and a set of human remains would surface. At first, whispers spread. Perhaps Derek had finally been found. Perhaps this was a tragic but inevitable end to his story. Only it wasn't. The remains belonged to someone else entirely. Another young man who had vanished almost the same week as Derek, leaving behind his own strange trail of unanswered questions. And so the mystery only deepened. To this day, Derek Lueking's disappearance is one of the most haunting unsolved cases in the Smokies. Not just because of what is known, but because of the vast gulf of what isn't. He left behind no final words beyond that short, cryptic note. No trail to follow. No reason that satisfies the aching questions of those who loved him. What was he searching for in those mountains? Freedom? Escape? A test of survival? Or was he walking into something else? Something he knew, and we can only guess at? This is a story of a young man who slipped into America's most visited national park and was never seen again. A story of family, of survivalist dreams, of a search that turned desperate. It is a story threaded with dread, unanswered prayers, and the unshakable sense that somewhere in those dark forests, the mountains themselves still hold Derek's truth. And tonight, we follow the trail he left behind, the trail that vanishes almost as soon as it begins. Before his name ever appeared on missing person flyers, before search dogs combed through ridges and valleys, Derek Joseph Lueking was simply a young man searching for meaning. 24 years old, born and raised in Tennessee, he carried himself with a kind of restless quiet. Friends described him as intelligent, thoughtful, maybe even a little introverted. He wasn't the life of the party, but he wasn't a recluse either. He lived mostly in his own mind, drawn to questions most people avoided. And among those questions was one that fascinated him to the point of obsession. How would a man survive if stripped of everything modern life provided? He devoured survival shows, especially the kind hosted by men like Bear Grylls, who seemed capable of conjuring fire from wet wood or drinking from muddy streams as though nature had nothing on him. For Derek, these weren't just television stunts. They were windows into something raw, ancient. Life without safety nets, life reduced to its most primal essence. The idea called to him, not just as entertainment, but as a challenge. In the weeks leading up to his disappearance, Derek seemed to be preparing for something bigger than just a weekend camping trip. He bought gear, lots of it. A tent, a sleeping bag, a Gerber axe paracord, a headlamp, a compass and thermometer, granola bars, and even a Bear Grylls brand survival kit, complete with fire starters and multi-tools. On the surface, it looked like the shopping spree of a man ready to test himself against the wilderness. But those who later studied the case would find themselves haunted by a contradiction. Many of these items, most importantly the tent and sleeping bag, were left behind in his vehicle, untouched. If Derek intended to survive, why would he abandon the very things that would keep him alive? Was it an oversight or something more deliberate? On Friday, March 16th, 2012, Derek checked into the Microtel Inn and Suites in Cherokee, North Carolina, just outside the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Surveillance confirmed he arrived and checked in without incident. He didn't appear nervous, erratic, or visibly distressed. Yet, when investigators later searched his room, they found unsettling details. On the bed lay a Bible. On the floor, an empty liquor bottle. Two objects placed in the same room that, when viewed together, painted a picture of inner conflict. One of faith, one of numbness, one of surrender. At 4 a.m. on Saturday, March 17th, Derek left the hotel. The world was still dark, the roads empty as he drove upward into the Smokies. By 8:30 a.m., just hours later, his family, already concerned enough to check, located his car parked at Newfound Gap, a popular overlook straddling the border of Tennessee and North Carolina. The vehicle sat in the lot like an abandoned clue, its white frame catching the morning light. Inside, rangers found the survival gear he had left behind and a note. 7 words. Short, cold, and devastating. Don't try to follow me. It is one of the most haunting fragments of the entire case. A sentence that can be read in multiple ways. Was it a warning? That anyone who tried to search for him might face the same fate? Was it a plea? That he needed solitude? That he wanted space to clear his head? Or was it a final goodbye? The last words of a man who intended never to return? His family could not agree. Some clung to hope, insisting Derek had simply gone into the mountains to test himself, to live a survivalist fantasy before coming home. Others felt the chill of finality in those words, the undertone of someone preparing to end their own story. And then there were those who wondered if Derek's disappearance was neither suicide nor survival trial, but something else entirely. Perhaps he wanted to start over, to shed his old life and vanish into the wild with nothing tying him back. But if that were true, why leave the car behind in such a visible place? Why not drive further, erase his trail more effectively? Why leave a breadcrumb at all? The Smokies are not an easy place to understand. They are vast, swallowing up more than 500,000 acres of ridges, valleys, and dense forest. More than 850 miles of trails cut through them. But even those marked paths can be treacherous. Step just a few feet off the trail, and you are consumed by an ocean of trees so thick they blot out the sun. Fog can descend without warning, disorienting even experienced hikers. Weather can turn violent in an instant. Rain, snow, freezing wind. Standing at Newfound Gap is like standing on a threshold. Behind you, pavement, people, civilization. Ahead of you, endless green wilderness, older than memory, indifferent to whether you survive or vanish. It was here that Derek parked, stepped out of his car, and crossed that invisible line. From that moment on, his story becomes a void. Searchers later debated which direction he might have gone. The Appalachian Trail cuts directly across the overlook. From it, other trails branch outward. The Boulevard Trail, the Sweat Heifer Creek Trail, each one leading deeper into shadow. But what if Derek had chosen none of them? What if instead he walked directly into the forest, off-trail, at 4 a.m. when darkness concealed every step? That possibility terrified rescuers. Because on a trail, there is order. Off-trail, there is chaos. The gear he left behind raised more questions than it answered. If Derek had meant to live, why not take a tent? The sleeping bag? Was he trying to prove he could survive with only his wits? Or was survival never the plan at all? Some investigators later suggested that the purchases themselves might not have been preparation for life, but camouflage for death, as if Derek had been trying to convince those around him, and maybe even himself, that he was planning an adventure, when in truth he was preparing for a final disappearance. And yet, one detail lingers like an ember against that theory. Derek had a tattoo across his chest, written in Japanese script. The word was life. permanent, inked into his skin, chosen deliberately. Why would a man who wore that word so proudly throw his own life away? The contradiction is unbearable, but so is silence. When the sun rose that morning, Derek was already gone. Rangers would soon organize massive searches. Family and strangers alike would call his name into the void. Helicopters would scan the ridges. Dogs would track faint trails. But in that first moment, when the car was discovered, when the note was read, when the survival gear was found uselessly stacked in the back seat, the sense of dread was already there. Something had pulled Derek into wilderness. Whether it was despair, determination, or some mysterious third force, no one could say. But the Smokies had opened their mouth, and Derek had walked in. And once the mountains swallow, they rarely give back. And that's just the beginning. The further we follow Derek's trail, the stranger and darker the questions become. Did he walk into the Smokies chasing freedom, or running from something he couldn't escape? If you don't want to miss the next turn in this mystery, make sure you hit subscribe, because the mountains hold their secrets tightly, and we're only just starting to pry them loose. The first rule of searching for the missing is this: you begin where they were last seen. For Derek Joseph Lueking, that meant a car parked at Newfound Gap, thousands of feet above sea level, where the wind sliced cold even in March and the forest stretched endlessly in every direction. His white Ford Escape sat there like a silent witness, its interior telling fragments of a story no one could quite finish. The note, the gear left behind, the faint warmth of a seatbelt. Beyond that, there was nothing. But nothing is a dangerous word in the Smoky Mountains, because nothing can mean a man is gone forever, or it can mean he is standing just beyond sight, hidden by a curtain of trees. The clock was ticking. By the time Derek's family realized something was wrong, it was already late morning. The hours between his leaving the hotel at 4 a.m. and his car being found around 8:30 a.m. were crucial. In those pre-dawn hours, Derek could have covered several miles. On a well-marked trail, that distance would have been difficult but traceable. Off-trail, however, it would have been enough to vanish into the bowels of the park. And so began one of the most intensive searches the Smoky Mountains had seen in years. Searchers fanned out from Newfound Gap, branching into the sprawling maze of trails. The Appalachian Trail, Sweat Heifer Creek Boulevard Trail. Dogs were brought in, their handlers straining at leashes as the hounds pressed noses to soil, hoping for a thread of Derek's scent. Helicopters circled overhead, their blades beating the fog into tatters as spotters peered down into canopies so dense they formed living ceilings. The U.S. Park Service coordinated with volunteers, family members, and local agencies. For days, the mountains echoed with the sound of Derek's name, shouted into silence. And yet the silence always won. Part of what made the search so maddening was Derek's preparation or lack thereof. On one hand, he had purchased survival gear in the weeks before, items that suggested he planned for the wilderness. On the other hand, those very tools, the tent and sleeping bag, were left untouched in his car. If Derek had carried them with him, the searchers could have followed the logic of his survival, where he might have camped, where he might have gathered water, how he might have sought shelter. But without them, the map was blank. Had Derek gone into the woods, intending only a short walk, a day hike that turned into something else? Or had he chosen deliberately to strip down his supplies, to walk into mountains unarmed, unprotected, like a man stepping into a trial by fire? The searchers couldn't know. All they had were possibilities, and possibilities are poison in a search effort. Still, the teams pressed on. They scoured ravines where runoff carved into the earth. They pushed into thickets of rhododendrons so dense that you could walk 10 feet and lose sight of the person ahead of you. They followed animal trails, dry creek beds, game crossings. The Smokies are not forgiving land. In some places, the slopes pitch down so steeply that one misstep sends you tumbling dozens of feet. In others, the vegetation is so thick you can't see the ground beneath you, each footstep a gamble. Searchers endured mud, cold, and fatigue. For Derek's family, each hour stretched into torture. They had to balance hope with fear, waiting for the phone to ring, for someone to tell them, "We've found him. He's okay." But the phone never rang with good news. And then came the dogs. For a moment, there was hope. One of the K-9 units picked up a faint scent trail near Newfound Gap, the same place Derek's car had been found. The dogs pulled eagerly, leading handlers down toward a forested slope into the deep shadows of the park. But just as quickly as the scent was found, it was lost. The dogs circled, confused, unable to regain it. Whether Derek had masked his trail or the terrain simply swallowed it, no one could say. For the family, the collapse of that lead was devastating. It was the closest thing to progress, and it had vanished like smoke. Searches often have phases. At first, there's urgency, the adrenaline-fueled rush to cover ground. After a few days, there's fatigue, the grim realization that time is slipping away. And finally, there's dread, the recognition that you may not be searching for a living person anymore. For Derek, that shift happened fast. The days bled into one another. Rangers mapped grids, checked ravines, traced the Appalachian Trail in both directions. Helicopters scanned with infrared, hoping to pick up the heat of a campfire, the warmth of a body. But night after night, the mountains remained dark. No Derek, no fire, no trace. It was as if he had stepped off the face of the earth. The psychological weight of that void began to crush his family. His mother, desperate for answers, replayed every detail of Derek's last weeks, every conversation. Had there been signs? Had he spoken about leaving? Had the survival shows and gear purchases been a clue? Friends wondered the same. They described Derek as introverted but not withdrawn, contemplative but not lost. He wasn't the kind of man who broadcast despair. Yet the note, "Don't try to follow me," read like the words of someone determined to cut ties. But why? Why here in the heart of the Smokies? Why so young, with so much ahead of him? It was a question no one could answer. And so the search stretched on. The Smoky Mountains have seen many disappearances, more than most people realize. Hikers vanish. Hunters go missing. Some are found within days. Others are never seen again. Every ranger knew this history. They knew the land could be merciless. They knew that if Derek had strayed too far, if he'd been injured, if the cold had caught him unprepared, the odds of survival dropped to near zero within days. Still, they searched for a week, then two, for mile after mile, and they found nothing. The official search was eventually scaled back. Resources had to shift. Volunteers had jobs, lives, obligations. Rangers could not comb the same ridges forever. But for Derek's family, the search never ended. They kept asking questions, chasing whispers, following rumors of sightings. Some claimed to have seen a man resembling Derek on trails in the months that followed. Others speculated he had left the park entirely, slipping into a new life, hidden from the world. But none of those claims were ever verified. What haunted the family most was the silence, the absence of answers. The idea that Derek could be out there, somewhere alive or dead, or something between, his story locked away in the trees. In time, another mystery would deepen the pain. Because 5 years later, in the same mountains where Derek disappeared, human remains would surface. For a moment, the family braced for closure. At last, perhaps, the search was over. At last, Derek had been found. But the truth was stranger. The remains weren't his. They belonged to another man entirely. Another disappearance layered over Derek's, like a grim echo. And so Derek's story returned to silence. A silence that lingers to this day. The car sat in the newfound Gap parking lot like a ghost ship anchored in the wrong harbor. It wasn't hidden in the woods, abandoned off a dirt road, or left at some obscure trailhead where few would notice. It was parked neatly, in plain sight, surrounded by the churn of hikers and tourists who passed by daily. To anyone else, it was just another vehicle, another visitor to the Smokies. But for Derek's family, who drove up that morning and found it, the car was a coffin of questions. Inside lay the gear he had bought for survival, the tent, the sleeping bag, the tools, and yet none of it had been taken with him. His family peered in, hoping for a clue, a sign of direction, anything that might explain what he was planning. And that's when they found the note. 7 words. "Don't try to follow me." It was scrawled simply, without flourish or explanation. Not a letter, not a farewell, not even a plea. Just a warning, or perhaps a command. The words carried a gravity that pressed on everyone who read them. They left interpretation dangling like baited hooks, pulling people into their own conclusions. Was Derek warning that his path was dangerous, that anyone who came after him might suffer the same fate? Or was it his way of severing ties, telling those he loved that this was not their burden to carry? Some read despair in those words. Others read determination, and some thought it sounded eerily like a line meant to close a door forever. For his mother, the note was unbearable. In interviews, she would later say she couldn't accept that her son meant to disappear. She believed he had simply needed time in the wilderness to test himself, to find clarity, and that he would return. She clung to hope because the alternative was unthinkable. But even hope can curdle in the face of silence. Investigators swarmed over the vehicle, cataloging every item. Each piece of gear left behind was a contradiction, evidence that could be read two entirely different ways. If Derek had meant to survive, then abandoning his supplies was reckless, even suicidal. But if Derek had meant to die, why bother buying them at all? Why go through the motions of equipping yourself if you plan never to use them? The contradiction formed a knot at the heart of the case, one no one has been able to untangle. And then there was the Bible and the liquor bottle found in his hotel room. Together, the objects painted a haunting portrait. Faith and despair side by side, conviction and surrender living under the same roof. Was Derek's disappearance a spiritual pilgrimage, an attempt to strip himself down to nothing so he could rebuild? Or was it a death march, a man resolving his soul before stepping off the cliff? No one could know for sure. The location of the car was equally unsettling. Newfound Gap is not a quiet, isolated spot. It is one of the busiest and most iconic overlooks in the Great Smoky Mountains, a gateway into the Appalachian Trail itself. If Derek wanted to vanish, why choose a starting point so visible? Perhaps that was the point. By parking where countless visitors come and go, he may have hoped to blend his absence into the churn of strangers. His car wouldn't raise suspicion. It would just be another vehicle among many. But Derek miscalculated, because his family was already searching for him, and when they found the car, they found a note. It was no longer a disappearance hidden in the shadows. It was an enigma placed under a spotlight. Searchers began by working outward from the parking lot. The Appalachian Trail cut north and south, stretching into hundreds of miles. Other paths splintered off: Boulevard Trail, Sweat Heifer Creek, Alum Cave. Each route was plausible, but none gave certainty. And then there was the most unsettling possibility of all, that Derek had chosen no trail at all, that he had stepped directly into the dense forest surrounding the gap, swallowed up by a wall of trees only a few feet from the asphalt. If that was the case, the search area expanded from dozens of miles to hundreds, and the odds of finding him diminished to nearly zero. The note haunted the search as much as the car did. Volunteers whispered about it as they trudged up trails, their voices hushed as though speaking too loudly might wake something. Park rangers debated whether it was a cry for help or a warning meant to keep them away. Even the dogs, when they briefly caught Derek's scent before losing it, seemed to falter under the invisible weight of those words. "Don't try to follow me." Some said it sounded like the words of a man ready to take his own life. Others insisted it was a voice of someone testing himself, who didn't want to be interrupted. But what if it was neither? What if the note wasn't a warning at all, but a clue, meant to suggest he had no intention of returning? Not because he planned to die, but because he planned to keep going. Disappearances are rarely straightforward, and Derek's was already beginning to unravel into a tangle of possibilities. For his family, the discovery of the car and note was both a relief and a fresh wound. Relief, because they had something concrete, something that narrowed the question of where he had gone. A wound, because the note sounded final, the kind of thing you write when you're walking away from everything you've ever known. His mother refused to accept that her son had given up. She insisted he was out there, somewhere, surviving, waiting, perhaps even watching. Others in the family struggled to reconcile Derek's quiet demeanor with the chilling message he left behind. Theories began to swirl, some from those close to him, some from strangers on the internet. Had Derek staged his disappearance, planning to return under a new identity? Had he been lured or coerced into something darker? Or was the truth far simpler and far more tragic? That the mountains had swallowed him in their indifferent silence? In that parking lot, the story could have ended. The car, the note, the gear left behind. Enough material for speculation, enough pain for the family. But instead, it was only the beginning. Because as search teams moved into the woods, shouting Derek's name into the fog, the Smoky Mountains answered with silence. And silence, in a place like that, is never empty. It is a silence that feels alive, as though the trees themselves are holding their breath, listening and choosing not to answer. A silence that suggests Derek Joseph Lueking may not have walked into those woods alone. When Derek's car was discovered, the response was immediate. Park rangers, local deputies, and volunteers mobilized in force. The Smokies had swallowed people before, but Derek's case had all the urgency of a man who might still be alive, just waiting to be found. The search began at Newfound Gap, expanding outward in calculated rings. Tracking dogs were brought in, their noses pressed against Derek's clothing to catch his scent. At first, they seemed to find a trail leading into the woods, but within minutes it evaporated, as though the forest itself had swallowed the trace. To handlers, this was chilling. A lost hiker leaves breadcrumbs, footprints, broken branches, scraps of scent. But here, it was as if Derek had stepped off the map and into nothingness. Helicopters roared above the canopy, their blades chopping the sky as spotters scanned for flicker of movement, the glint of gear, or even a faint color of clothing against green. Nothing. Not a tent, not a fire, not a trace of human life. Ground teams pushed down trails, radios crackling in the fog. Every hiker they passed was asked, "Have you seen this man?" Most hadn't. A few claimed they might have, but none of the reports could be verified. The mountains blur faces, muddle memory. Every stranger looks like another. For Derek's family, the days stretched into a blur of waiting. They set up at the command post, clinging to updates, each hour swinging between hope and despair. His mother refused to believe he was gone. "He's strong," she insisted. "He knows how to survive. He just needs time." But rangers knew the statistics. The Smoky Mountains are vast, more than 500,000 acres of ridges and ravines. Within 24 hours, a lost person has a chance. Within 72, the odds plummet. After a week, survival becomes unlikely, unless that person's gear. And Derek had left his gear behind. Every detail pulled the searchers deeper into unease. He had bought survival tools, yet didn't take them. He had left a note, but no direction. He had parked at the busiest overlook, then vanished into silence. As days turned into weeks, the manpower shrank. Helicopters returned to base. Volunteers went home. Dogs grew tired. The forest remained untouched. It was as though Derek had been erased, leaving only questions behind. But the strangest part wasn't the silence. It was the absence of evidence. In disappearances, the wilderness usually leaves a trace. A dropped bottle, a torn piece of clothing, a scrap of gear washed down a ravine. But here, nothing emerged. Not a thread, not a shoe print, not even the echo of a struggle. The Smokies had taken Derek Joseph Lueking and given back nothing. And for his family, that silence grew heavier than grief. Because silence doesn't just mean gone. Silence whispers, maybe he's still out there. That was the thought that kept his mother searching long after others stopped. And it was a thought that haunted rangers as they packed up their equipment. Because sometimes in the Great Smoky Mountains, a disappearance feels less like getting lost and more like being taken. With the search yielding nothing, the conversation shifted from where is Derek to what was he trying to do? Everyone who looked at his case seemed to see something different in him, and each interpretation spun into a theory. The first was the suicide theory. The note, "Don't try to follow me," read like a farewell to many. The abandoned survival gear reinforced it. Why pack for the woods if he never planned to use it? Add the Bible and liquor bottle from his hotel room, and it painted a picture of a young man wrestling with faith and despair in his final hours. Rangers admitted quietly that, in many missing hiker cases, this was a grim truth. People walking into the wilderness to end their lives, never to be found. But Derek's family resisted that explanation. His mother rejected it outright. She described him as strong, adventurous, and optimistic. To her, the note wasn't a suicide message. It was Derek protecting others, telling them not to risk themselves by chasing him into terrain he knew would be punishing. That led to the survivalist theory. Derek had been fascinated with shows like Man vs. Wild, absorbing the idea of escaping society and proving himself against nature. Some thought his disappearance was a test, a chance to strip away the comforts of modern life and survive on skill and grit. But if that was the plan, why leave behind the very tools he would need? Was it pride? Or did he believe he didn't need them? Others whispered a third possibility, a staged disappearance. Derek hadn't died, and he wasn't hiding in the woods. He had walked away entirely. A new identity, a new life. The note in his car wasn't despair. It was closure, a way to sever ties without explanation. It's the kind of theory people cling to when no evidence surfaces, when the silence stretches too long. But silence has its own weight. If Derek had ended his life, why wasn't his body found? If he was surviving, how did he remain invisible for so long in a park that sees millions of visitors a year? And if he staged his disappearance, why hasn't a single trace surfaced in more than a decade? Each theory answered one question, but unraveled 10 more. The Smokies became less a backdrop and more a character in his story. Ancient, indifferent, capable of swallowing the truth whole. By now, the case had become more than just a missing person report. It was a puzzle with no corner pieces, a riddle where every answer was wrong. And then, years later, something surfaced in the mountains that twisted the story even further. A discovery that seemed, for a moment, to be Derek's tragic end, only for it to take the mystery somewhere darker. For years after Derek's disappearance, the Smoky Mountains held their silence. The family lived in limbo, the search long abandoned by authorities but never by his mother. She kept his photo in a local paper, posted update online, begged hikers to keep their eyes open. She clung to the smallest thread of hope, because as long as no body was found, Derek was neither gone nor alive. He was suspended in an unbearable maybe. Then, in 2013, the call came. A backpack had been found deep in the mountains. And not just any backpack. It matched the description of one Derek had purchased before vanishing. Near it, scattered bones. The discovery sent shockwaves. The Smokies had finally given something back. Search teams returned to the area, combing through underbrush and creeks, mapping every inch around the site. The family braced themselves for the answer they dreaded, but also craved. Confirmation. If it was Derek, at least a nightmare of not knowing would end. They could bury him. They could grieve. The media picked up the story quickly. Headlines read like closure. Remains in Smokies may belong to missing Tennessee man online forums buzzed with speculation. People debated whether the bones proved the suicide theory or the survivalist theory gone wrong. Some said he must have slipped, fallen, and died alone. Others whispered he had starved. For his mother, the news landed like a hammer. She cried, but she also spoke with strange steadiness. If it's Derek, at least he's been found. Years of torment might finally be ending. Investigators sent the remains for testing. DNA swabs were taken. Days stretched into weeks, weeks into months. The family waited in unbearable limbo, caught between the past and an answer they couldn't control. Then the results came back. The remains weren't Derek's. The bones belonged to someone else entirely. Another man, another tragedy, another mystery of the mountains. The backpack wasn't Derek's either. The initial description was wrong. The hope for closure crumbled overnight. The twist was almost too much to bear. For a moment, they'd been allowed to believe they might know Derek's fate. For a moment, they had been granted the cruel mercy of finality. And then, just as quickly, it was torn away. The case returned to its ghostly silence, but now another layer of horror. How many people vanish in these mountains, and how many lie undiscovered in its depths? If Derek's backpack and remains weren't his, then whose were they? The Smokies are the most visited national park in the United States. Millions hike its trails every year, but not all return. Search and rescue logs are filled with disappearances, some solved, some unsolved. Derek was not the only one to walk into those woods and never walk out. But what chilled people most was the reminder that the mountains were littered with secrets. Secrets stacked on secrets. You could search for one ghost and stumble upon another. For Derek's family, the false ending deepened the wound. Not only was Derek still missing, but now the mystery felt bottomless. They had been shown how easily the wilderness could play tricks, how quickly a lead could turn into dust. His mother's hope flickered painfully. She said afterward that she could feel Derek was still out there, that a mother knows, and yet the world around her kept insisting that maybe she would never know. The false discovery rippled outward, reshaping the way people viewed Derek's case. Theories multiplied again. Some asked, what if Derek's remains were still out there, just not yet stumbled upon? Others leaned into the staged disappearance theory. If those bones weren't his, maybe he never died in the Smokies at all. But the mountains, once again, refused to answer. The cruelest twist of all wasn't just a false ending. It was what it did to the people left behind. To be given closure, only to have it ripped away, is a torment that can't be explained. It's like being told a wound has finally healed, only to have it reopened, deeper and bloodier than before. And that's what the Smokies seem to do best in Derek's story. Reopen a wound again and again until it bled into legend. By the end of it, the remains didn't belong to Derek, but the tragedy might as well have. His name became tied not just to his disappearance, but to the idea that the mountains themselves keep secrets deliberately. Because if Derek wasn't those bones, then he was still out there, somewhere, alive, dead, or something in between. And that uncertainty is more haunting than any grave. And here's the thing. Every time we think the trail is about to give us answers, it only unravels further. One mystery folds into another, and the questions keep multiplying. If you want to keep pulling at these threads with me, make sure you subscribe. Because in stories like this, the truth doesn't come all at once. It comes in fragments, hidden in the shadows. And the next piece may change everything. The Smoky Mountains are beautiful, yes, but they're also something more primal. To those who feel lost, overwhelmed, or searching for meaning, the wilderness can whisper like a siren. It offers both freedom and oblivion, the chance to vanish completely. Psychologists studying disappearances like Derek's point to a phenomenon sometimes called wilderness calling. For people weighed down by depression, disillusionment, or the chaos of modern life, the woods represent a clean slate, a place where the noise stops, a place where no one demands, no one judges, no one expects. And Derek seemed to fit that mold, at least on the surface. He had survival gear, the note in his car, and a fascination with testing himself against the wild. In many ways, it looked like a textbook case. A young man drawn by the fantasy of stripping life down to its bare essentials, where everything could be decided by his own will. But then came the contradictions. Why leave the survival tools behind? Why check into a hotel, buy liquor, bring a Bible, and then abandon it all? Why park at the busiest overlook in the Smokies, a place swarming with tourists, if what he wanted was solitude? Derek's choices seemed designed to confuse, as though even in leaving, he wanted to remain half seen, half hidden. Some believed Derek wasn't escaping into the wilderness at all, but into himself. The note, "Don't try to follow me," may not have been about physical danger but emotional distance. He might have been saying, "Don't come after me. Don't try to fix what I'm breaking. This is mine to do." And if that's true, the Smokies weren't just a location. They were a mirror, a place vast enough to hold his struggle, silent enough to keep his secrets. There's also the darker possibility that Derek didn't plan to survive at all, that the mountains were his chosen place to end things, and the abandoned gear was deliberate, a rejection of tools, a stripping away of lifelines. In this interpretation, the note was final, not protective, and the silence of the forest isn't evidence of survival, but of a body still hidden somewhere within. Yet the false discovery of remains years later complicated that view. If Derek truly had ended his life, surely by now, some trace would have been found. But nothing has surfaced. Not a bone, not a scrap of clothing. And in a park as heavily trafficked as the Smokies, that absence feels almost impossible, which leads back to the most unsettling possibility of all. Derek may never have been in those woods to begin with. It would not be the first time a disappearance was staged at the Smokies. Park officials quietly acknowledged that people sometimes use the mountains as a stage for vanishing. Parking cars, leaving notes, planting a breadcrumb trail, and then slipping away under a different identity. If that's what Derek did, then the wilderness was not his grave, but his alibi. And that's the problem with Derek's case. Every theory feels right for a moment, until it collapses under its own weight. He was a survivalist, except he abandoned his gear. He was suicidal, except no remains were found. He staged his disappearance, except no trace of new life has surfaced. It's as if Derek built a puzzle with missing pieces on purpose, ensuring no one could ever solve it. For his family, the psychological maze is worse than grief, because grief has an ending. Mystery does not. It keeps them awake at night, wondering not just where Derek is, but why. And maybe that's the cruelest truth of all. Sometimes the wilderness doesn't just take people. It takes their stories too, leaving only fragments for the living to cling to. By the time Derek Lueking's case hit national attention, the Smoky Mountains already carried a reputation. For decades, hikers had whispered about its vanishing points, the places where people stepped off a trail and seemed to dissolve into thin air. The Smokies are the most visited national park in the United States. Millions of people stream through each year, and yet some never come back. Rangers will tell you the truth. There are bodies in those woods that will never be recovered. The terrain is too vast, the slopes too punishing, the undergrowth too thick. Even with helicopters and infrared scans, the park swallows evidence whole. And it's not new. Go back to 1969, and you'll find the story of Dennis Martin, a 6-year-old boy who vanished while playing hide-and-seek near Spencefield. Hundreds of searchers, including Green Berets, combed the mountains. They found nothing. To this day, Dennis is still missing, his story folded into the lore of the Smokies. There's Trenny Gibson, a 16-year-old who disappeared during a school field trip in 1976. One moment she was walking with classmates, the next she was gone. Despite massive searches, she was never seen again. More recent cases mirror the same pattern. People leaving cars at trailheads, venturing into the trees, and never being found. Derek's disappearance seemed to echo these stories. His car at Newfound Gap, his note, his absence. For those who follow these cases, the parallels were chilling. It was as if the Smokies demanded a toll every few years, and Derek was simply the latest. But that eerie reputation cuts two ways. On one hand, it explains a lack of answers. The mountains are merciless, and once they take someone, they rarely give them back. On the other hand, it feeds the darker myths that something more than terrain is at work, that the Smokies themselves choose who stays and who leaves. Locals talk about places where compasses spin, where fog rolls in without warning, where sound carries strangely through the valleys. There are Cherokee legends of spirits in the ridges, guardians, tricksters, watchers in the mist. For families like Derek's, those stories are no comfort, but they linger, pass from hiker to hiker, growing every time another person disappears. The truth is, Derek wasn't just one man who vanished. He became part of a tapestry of missing people, each thread woven into the mountain's legend, and the false discovery of remains years later only deepened that legend. It proved that Derek wasn't the only ghost haunting the Smokies, that even when you think you found one answer, it may belong to someone else entirely. For investigators, the unsolved cases stack up like unfinished sentences. For families, they're open wounds. And for storytellers, they're fuel for an unsettling thought. That the Smokies aren't just a national park. They're a labyrinth, and some who enter never walk out. And so Derek's story remains unresolved. Not just a personal tragedy, but part of a greater eerie pattern. A reminder that in certain places, vanishing isn't exception, it's the rule. Years have passed since Derek Joseph Lueking left his car at Newfound Gap. The seasons in the Smokies have shifted again and again. Spring blossoms carpeting the valleys, summer storms hammering the ridges, autumn leaves burning red and gold, winter snow silencing the trails. Time moves on, but Derek remains frozen on March 17th, 2012, forever 24 years old, forever walking into the mist. For his family, that's the cruelest part. They don't have a place to visit, a gravestone to touch, or an answer to hold on to. They have only questions, looping endlessly in their minds. Did Derek wander off the trail and fall where no one could find him? Did he intend to start a new life, leaving them behind in a cruel attempt at reinvention? Did he seek solitude or did he seek an end? The false discovery remains only twisted the knife deeper, to be given closure and then have it ripped away, is a wound that never fully heals. Every news article, every rumor, every whisper of sighting or a found item pulls him back into hope, only for hope to collapse again. And the Smokies keep their secrets. That's what lingers most about Derek's case. The silence. It's not loud or dramatic. It's not the chaos of crime scenes or the trail of suspects. It's the absence of everything. No evidence, no body, no answers, just silence. And silence is its own kind of torment, because in silence, imagination takes over. For some, Derek's story becomes a cautionary tale about the danger of wandering unprepared. For others, it becomes almost mythic. The young man who disappeared into the mountains, swallowed whole. For his family, though it's not myth, it's not folklore, it's a wound. When hikers pass through Newfound Gap today, they might not notice the echoes. They might not know that a car once sat there, that inside it was a note saying, "Don't try to follow me." They might not know a life disappeared right there, one that has never been accounted for. But if you linger long enough, it's hard not to wonder, where did he go? Did the mountains keep him? Or is he still out there, somewhere, walking a different trail, under a different name, in a different life? Maybe Derek found what he was searching for. Maybe he found peace. Or maybe the Smokies simply reminded us of something we don't like to admit. That in a world mapped and measured, there are still places where you can vanish without a trace. And perhaps that's the final, haunting truth. Derek's story doesn't end in an answer. It ends in the same silence that began it. A silence that grows heavier with each passing year. The mountains don't speak. They don't explain. They don't return what they've taken. And so the question remains, echoing to the ridges and the valleys, unanswered, unsettling, eternal. What happened to Derek Joseph Lueking? And that question is why his story lingers. If you've been following this far, you already know closure never came and maybe never will. If you don't want to miss the next chilling story, the next unraveling thread, make sure you hit subscribe. Because mysteries like this don't fade, they grow deeper. And the Smokies aren't done keeping their secrets.